I don't like the idea that you always have to talk about who an author is in order to understand her or his work. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about Emily Brontë before I start to talk about all of her writing, not just the one novel, but her hundreds of poems and the diary entries that she did. Because without knowing a little bit about who she was, the fact that she is one of the great writers of imagination is lost. Because the things that she experienced were slight and small, but the things that she dreamt and wrote and believed and felt were the world. So she died young, as we think of it, but not particularly young in those days, if you like. She grew up, she was the fifth of 6 children. She was the second youngest daughter. And for most of her life, she lived in a parsonage in Haworth in Yorkshire. In that parsonage, she had an older sister and an older sister and an older sister. And Maria died when she was 10, and Elizabeth died when she was 9 or 10. And they were away at a school where Charlotte, the next sister, and Emily were too. And imagine everything that you have heard about the worst of the way that children were treated, and girls in particular were treated, and the environment in which those 4 children sent away, their mother was dead, to that place. So she had already seen, when she was very young, the death of her mother and her 2 older sisters. She came back to that parsonage, and although she left it 3 more times, she went to teach, once to Dewsbury, once to Halifax, and once to Brussels. Basically, when she was not there, she was homesick. She was dying for not being there. She is one of those people who everything that she needed, she could create out of nothing in her head. So she was born 1 year after the great and brilliant Jane Austen died. They have more in common than people often think. John mentioned the difference of the lack of society around Jane Austen in terms of writers, but they did both have sisters, one in Jane's case, several in Emily's case, who loved them and talked to them and worked together with them. So what is it that makes, for me, this particular writer more important than Jane Austen? Jane Austen, I agree with John, is probably the best at dialogue of that generation of writers, and possibly ever. She is funny. She is witty. Everything that is thrown against Jane Austen, this idea that she didn't feel, is clearly ridiculous. But in the end, for me, what she was writing about was the purpose of romance, the happy ever after ending, the idea of marriage, that amount of any of our lives, if we're lucky, that will occupy, however, a small amount of what life is. For me, when I read Emma and Pride and Prejudice, and listening to it this afternoon and hearing everybody acting, the world is a lighter, better place because of Jane Austen's novels, no doubt. But when I read them, I was left thinking there must be more than simply the pursuit of marriage. The unhappiness of marriage, the small world about which she was writing. All of us as novelists write about the worlds that we can write about. We cannot be anybody else. We can only write the stories that we have it in us to write. And you will not be surprised to know, because I write big adventure stories about war and faith, that I like the epic. I like melodrama. I like the big emotions, not the perfectly delicately drawn ones. But in Wuthering Heights, I think it was Calvino that said, a classic is a classic book because it has never finished what it has to say. And I have read Wuthering Heights every generation of my 50-plus years. And every time I read it, it is a different book. So we think of it as a love story. Is it? No, it's not a love story. It's a story of obsession, yes, but it's also a story of ghosts, a story of haunting. And the first extract that I'm going to hand over to the wonderful actors comes from very, very early on in the novel, in chapter 3. And the story, you all know this, It is told by two narrators who swap backwards and forwards, a man called Lockwood, who, if you like, is the representative of the middle class, the ordinary, the respectable, the acceptable. And he has come to this part of Yorkshire and has taken a house, a beautiful grange, and he has gone to meet for the very first time the strange landlord of whom he has heard a lot of talk but knows nothing about him. This man is called Heathcliff. And he goes to find him, and he finds a setup with a young girl who appears to be the mistress of the house, but to whom is she married? A boy that appears to be somehow connected, a master of the house, but he is treated like a servant and he speaks like a servant in a local accent. And there is no delineation between the servants and the people who run the house, and there are animals everywhere, and there is this threat of something other, something not respectable and accepted. And then, of course, this is Wuthering Heights, and the storm comes in, and Lockwood cannot leave. And so he is shown to a room that has never been used for a long time, and it's musty, and there are little words written on the sill, a name over and over again, Catherine Linton, Catherine Earnshaw. And he goes to sleep, and he has a terrible nightmare, and he wakes up. And then he goes to sleep again, and again he wakes up. And so Samuel is going to read Lockwood, and Mariah is going to read The Ghost of Cathy, and Dominic is going to read Heathcliff.
This time, I heard distinctly the gusty wind and the driving of the snow. I heard also the fir bough repeat its teasing sound. It annoyed me so much that I resolved to silence it. I rose and endeavoured to unclasp the casement. The hook was soldered into the staple. I must stop it, I muttered, knocking my knuckles through the glass and stretching an arm out to seize the importunate branch, instead of which my fingers closed on the fingers of a little ice-cold hand. The intense horror of nightmare came over me. I tried to draw back my arm, but the hand clung to it, and a most melancholy voice sobbed,
"Let me in. Let me in."
"Who are you?"
"I'm Catherine Linton. I've come home. I'd lost my way on the moor."
As it spoke, I discerned obscurely a child's face looking through the window. Terror made me cruel, and finding it useless to attempt shaking the creature off, I pulled its wrist onto the broken pane and rubbed it to and fro till the blood ran down and soaked the bedclothes. Still it wailed,
"Let me in."
The fingers relaxed. I snatched mine through the hole, hurriedly piled the books up in a pyramid against it, and stopped my ears to exclude the lamentable prayer.
"It's 20 years. 20 years.
And Lockwood shouts, disturb Heathcliff, who doesn't know that he's been put in this room. And of course, Heathcliff is ruined by grief and vengeance and all the things that have spoilt the person that he might have been. And he rushes into the room. And there he finds this guest he hardly knows, who starts to burble about someone at the window, a woman at the window, a girl at the window, someone called Catherine. And he tries to explain why he's in there and apologise, but he can't actually get any further because Heathcliff immediately looks at him and sees that Lockwood is in a state of shock, and Lockwood doesn't know what to make of Heathcliff.
"What can you mean? By talking in this way to me? How dare you? Under my roof, God, he's mad to speak thus."
Heathcliff gradually fell back into the shelter of the bed as I spoke, finally sitting down almost concealed behind it. I guessed, however, by his irregular and intercepted breathing, that he struggled to vanquish an access of violent emotion.
"Mr. Lockwood, you may go into my room. Your childish outcry has sent sleep to the devil for me. Take the candle and go where you please. I shall join you directly."
I obeyed so far as to quit the chamber, ignorant where the narrow lobbies led. I stood still and was witness, involuntarily, to a piece of superstition on the part of my landlord, which belied, oddly, his apparent sense. He got onto the bed and wrenched open the lattice, bursting, as he pulled at it, into an uncontrollable passion of tears.
"Come in. Come in," Cathy, do come. Do once more. Oh, my heart's darling, hear me this time. Catherine, at last.
The spectre showed a spectre's ordinary caprice. It gave no sign of being, but the snow and wind whirled wildly through, blowing out the light.
Blowing out the light. Now that is the beginning of this novel. It is a novel that is about ghosts and haunting, as I said, but it's also a novel that is about grief and men being allowed to have their emotions too. Not everything being kept down and kept controlled and kept in a certain sort of dance that makes it appropriate and nothing is unseemly. The shock when people first read this novel of seeing men weeping and talking about this is as important as the shock of seeing these wild women, if you like, who did not conform to the standards. So the first bit of the novel is Lockwood. He arrives and he goes back after this strange experience. And he goes back to the Grange where he's staying, where Nellie Dean is there. And he says, "Tell me about this man." He wants to know the whole story of Heathcliff, the strange household. And this is how the novel, if you like, gets going. And it's one of the great critics, Lord David Cecil, said it is one of the most effectively structured novels in the English language. So it is set up all the way through, if you like, principles of light and dark. There is the storm that is Wuthering Heights. There is the peace and the calm that is the Grange. There is the danger and the violence and the emotions that are shared between men and women at Wuthering Heights. The fact that servants and masters are on equal footing, both despised or both loved. Everything at Wuthering Heights happens in the kitchen, and the servants and the masters and the mistresses eat together or starve together in the kitchen. If you like, it is the unacceptable face of the world in which Emily Brontë and her sisters had seen a little bit of, and if you like, had withdrawn from. In the Grange, the principle of calm, the principle of light. There is Edgar Linton. There is the sense of everything is done properly. There are servants there, but they are out of sight. They do not eat with the family, but everything is calm and gentle. And of course, what happens is we start to hear the story from Nellie Dean. And we learn that Catherine's father had gone to Liverpool one day and had come back with a child that it is described in a way that he might be of mixed race. He's certainly described as very dark-haired and dark-skinned. Liverpool is, of course, the great and terrible slave port for Britain. And he comes back with this child and throws this child into the household of his spirited daughter and his sullen and rather surly son. And from that moment, there is the cuckoo in the nest. It is the idea that you cannot, if you like, just simply decide to do something differently. There will be consequences to everything that you do. And Cathy and Heathcliff, as you all know, they form a bond against the violence of the brother who beats her and beats him, and the sense that the father, Wuthering Heights, much like Austen in some ways, but Wuthering Heights is filled with children with no parents, with violent parents, with dead mothers, with no one who teaches them how to love well. And that, of course, is what people like Emily and Charlotte Brontë were seeing around them. They knew that this was the common treatment, if you like, in many of those clergymen's schools, the docks, the slum children. But of course, when Cathy goes, she sees this different life. They tiptoe down, she and Heathcliff, they see the Grange, they see a different sort of world, and they are caught, they run away. Another theme in the novel is the way that the dogs and the animals, if you like, are dangerous and violent. They are not pets, they are not to be petted. And Cathy is caught and bitten by the dog, and she is kept there at the Grange. Another theme throughout the novel, the idea of being kidnapped, kept in these two different places. And because of that, she starts to see a refinement that she lacks in Heathcliff. And in the end, as they grow older and Heathcliff gets angrier and angrier and puts up with the punishment that's meted out to him, but every single time he's becoming a little more brutalized, Cathy in the end decides that she will marry not Heathcliff, but someone else. And she does it, if you like, for the best of reasons. But she tries to explain this in the next extract we're going to hear, which again is quite early in the novel. It's in chapter 9, with a conversation with Nellie. Nellie is the servant who has been at Wuthering Heights. Nellie is in the Grange. Nellie represents the good Victorian servant, the person who knows that things at Wuthering Heights are not as they are supposed to be, that people do not behave as they're supposed to behave. And Catherine tries to explain why she is going to make this strange decision and not marry Heathcliff. And Heathcliff doesn't hear all of the conversation. He only hears the bad bit of it. And because of that, he leaves, and almost everything else is set in train in the novel. So we're going to hear an extract. Eleanor is going to read Nellie, and Mariah is going to read Catherine.
I was superstitious about dreams then, and am still. And Catherine had an unusual gloom in her aspect. It made me dread something from which I might shape a prophecy and foresee a fearful catastrophe. She was vexed, but she did not proceed. Apparently taking up another subject, she recommenced in a short time.
If I were in heaven, Nellie, I should be extremely miserable.
Because you are not fit to go there, all sinners will be miserable in heaven.
But it is not for that. I dreamt once that I was there.
I tell you, I won't hearken to your dreams, Miss Catherine.
I was only going to say that heaven did not seem to be my home. And I broke my heart with weeping to come back to earth, and the angels were so angry that they flung me out into the middle of the heath on the top of Wuthering Heights, where I woke, sobbing for joy. That will do to explain my secret as well as the other. I've no more business to marry Edgar Linton than I have to be in heaven. And if the wicked man in there had not brought Heathcliff so low, I shouldn't have thought of it. It would degrade me to marry Heathcliff now, so he shall never know how I love him. And that not because he's handsome, Nellie, but because he's more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same, and Linton's is as different as a moonbeam from lightning or frost from fire. I cannot express it, but surely you and everybody have a notion that there is or should be an existence of yours beyond you. What were the use of my creation if I were entirely contained here? My great miseries in this world have been Heathcliff's miseries, and I watched and felt each from the beginning. My greatest thought in living is himself. If all else perished and he remained, I should still continue to be. And if all else remained and he were annihilated, the universe would turn to a mighty stranger. I should not seem a part of it. My love for Linton is like the foliage in the woods. Time will change it, I'm well aware, as winter changes the trees. My love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath, a source of little visible delight, but necessary. Nellie, I am Heathcliff. He is always, always in my mind, not as a pleasure any more than I am always a pleasure to myself, but as my own being.